We've got a couple of other people that are going to join us. We have a couple of other of our members going to join us also, and they're coming in. Ryan is on. Welcome, Ryan. So, and let's see, we have somebody else, and that may be Sean. But let's go ahead and get started. And we have now enough. So, Ashley, if you would call the roll, we'll go ahead and get started on this.
Wallace Grainer.
Here.
Tom Farrell.
Here.
I'm going to pick up.
Meredith Knight.
Here.
Ronald Hasso.
Here. See you later.
Yeah.
Ryan Clinton.
Here.
And Mo Goyle.
Here.
And if that phone number calling in is a member of the strike force, please let us know. Ending in 543.
And we got one other one that's coming in, it looks like.
One may be Michael Levy from my office. I asked to join us.
Oh, great. And
He does a lot of planning with us, so I asked Michael to join in.
Great. Okay, well, let's just get started. Public comments. Do we have any of our public that would like to make any comments before we get started? And I'm not seeing any hands. And Ashley, how about you? Not seeing that either. Item number 2 is our minutes from the March 29th, 2021 meeting. And if anybody's had a chance to read these, which I read them today, and could I get a motion to either, well, we'll take a motion to approve these and then we'll have a discussion. So do we have a
Move to approve.
Thank you, sir.
And I'll second that.
And we have a second from Meredith. Are there any comments or additions or corrections that anyone would like to make on the minutes? And I'm not seeing anybody raise their hand. So I will just call the question. And again, if we're going to do this as kind of a little bit different, if you don't object to that and want to vote for approving the minutes, just leave your hand down. If you have any objection, please raise your hand. And so I will call the question, and this is to approve the minutes of the March 29th meeting. And I don't see any hands up, so the minutes are approved on that. And Matt, isn't that called a presumptive close, that when you do it that way, that you get to do it?
I chair some nonprofits, and I'm taking notes on process here. Thank you.
Drew, welcome. Mo, thank y'all for coming. And Sean, I see you're on here. So thank you for being there. I have 2 gentlemen with us that are maybe 3, but 2 at least that have been involved in BK's Road and grew up around here, that know a lot about what's happened in the West Bank over the last several decades on that. Wally, this is not, obviously you're the, you've been around longer than these 2 guys, but that's okay. They've been around too. So I thought I would invite them. Matt is an investor in real estate and my gosh, what else? Everything in the world that you'd get, and very involved in all of not only the West Bank, but the city of Austin. And I think many of y'all may know Matt, but Matt is head of a group that owns the hospital site off of BK's Road. So we've been talking about that some, so I thought that it would be good to have Matt here. Sean is also on the phone, and Sean grew up here and went to school, actually went to school with my daughter in high school at Westlake, and is now head of the Plains Capital over here off of Mara Vista in Rollingwood, and involved in a lot of activities going in the West Bank, looks at a lot of deals, does a bunch of deals. And I thought this would be prudent to not only visit with these gentlemen in regard to get their input about what has occurred on BK's Road and the West Bank, but what they see as the future of kind of what is going to be possible or desirable from a marketplace in the future and financeable and investable and doing all that stuff we can do. So what I'd like to do is just kind of bring up a couple questions, and then maybe Sean, you and Matt could kind of give us y'all's input on that to see. Our job as we go through this, and we've been tasked with looking at each lot in Rollingwood, specifically on Bee Cave Road, which is what we're working on right now, and trying to determine what we believe that, and we're doing some survey work, but being able to determine what our citizens would like to see go there. Now, a lot of times it may be something that we want, but is not feasible from a real estate standpoint or financing standpoint or market standpoint. So kind of, Matt, I'm going to start with you, if you don't mind, and just kind of give us, and let me just say this. One of the things that I would love for you to do is to say, look, you know, we currently have a hospital there. We may want to keep a hospital there, or we may want to look at some alternatives. So if you have any alternatives in mind, you know, please share them with us so we can kind of make consideration of that too. But generally, I'd like to see what your thoughts are in regard to marketplace conditions going forward 10, 20, even 30 years down the road on that might occur on Bee Cave Road. So.
Sure, Tom, thank you. So as for those of you who can read, I'm Matt Mathias, and I hope that appears up there, but I have been involved on Bee Cave Road for close to 30 years. Grew up here. My parents lived on Mistywood since the 1980s, but I was born in Austin, so been around a long time. And one of the things that we've seen with Rollingwood and your neighbor to the west, the city of Westlake Hills, we're not talking about them today, but some of the same type of impact has been seen when you think you're being sensitive to the environment, size, and shape of your buildings. It has limited developers to a more boxy configuration because of the limitations on land use, size of structures, overhangs, and those kind of things that have taken away some of the ability, I'll call it the artistic or architectural ability to make more appealing architecture, which makes a more livable place. And so sometimes actually, contrary to you know, what has been the thought of past decades is more density on a site often leads to better design, more walkable, more enjoyable spaces that occur rather than a building with a parking lot sitting in front of it. You know, new urbanism is a big, you know, catch term for planners today. But if you do look at some of those concepts of pulling the buildings to the street, bringing the parking behind, some of those kind of things, or underneath or internal to the building, you get a much more desirable streetscape, much more walkable. You end up with plazas and those kind of things. So that's what I would like to think of. Now, on our particular site, 3003 Bee Cave Road, where Arise Austin Medical Center is, that's at Bee Cave Woods Road and Bee Cave. You know, we're totally happy having the hospital there. We are the landlords. We don't operate the hospital. The hospital is happy there. The same owners now own and operate Westlake Hospital at Loop 360 in Bee Cave Road and this hospital. So there's now synergy between those two to create more services for the West Bank area by not overlapping them as much with the two hospitals. But Tom asked me to look at, you know, 20 years down the road, you know, what could these sites be? And I think you have two separate opportunities north of Bee Cave Road and south of Bee Cave Road. The south side really does not back up to any of your residents, just as the Endeavor track down by the church was kind of isolated from residential areas for the most part, it gave you the opportunity to add more density and more height. I think that's something this committee and ultimately the city council should look at, is on the south side where you really don't have direct impact to residential neighbors in Rollingwood. You may consider more height and more density than in other parts of the city. They're appropriate in some places and not in others is my point. I know Tom in particular for decades has espoused sales tax, and there are great uses that are part of a community that don't necessarily generate sales tax, but if you're planning for the future, look at these sites along Bee Cave Road and think about, does our community want, or are we interested in hotel and motel uses, in office and medical condominiums, in general office, medical office. I made a list a while ago, thinking about the reuse of 3003 Bee Cave Road, retail, sit-down restaurants. And one of the things you're going to see with sit-down restaurants now that the pandemic is ended or the pandemic has hit, we are seeing quality sit-down restaurants as they look for new locations to say, and we want a drive-through, because home delivery has become such a big part of their business model. They don't think it's ever going to end, where you pick your Perry Steakhouse, Bob's Steakhouse, whatever fine restaurant you like to go to, people are picking up, and delivery services are picking up. And if the model doesn't in the future have a drive-through for that pickup, you bog down parking and traffic by stopping people in the drop-off and pickup things. So those are kind of planning things for the future that this committee might want to think about. Is Rollingwood ever going to want quick service restaurants, what we call fast food? Maybe not today, but you go into some communities that are highly restricted, like Hilton Head, North Carolina, for example. They allow them, but they have to have a certain design that meets that community standards. And if you're thinking long run, think about things like coffee shops with drive-throughs, because those require that type of zoning. Tom, you're in our discussion, and George Kofers. George says, I need a neighborhood bar to be able to ride my bike to. And Tom always says after council meetings, they had to go over to Deep Eddy, our bars, or as Tom likes to call them, pubs. I think it sounds classier, Tom, but are there locations where that would be appropriate within the city in the future? I really would encourage you to do that. And here's the nasty word: multifamily. Whether it's condominium or whether it's for rent, there's all kinds of multifamily, and to outlaw it across the board, I think, is a mistake for a community, because generationally, we're now seeing trends in the real estate industry where older Americans are selling their homes that have a lot of equity in them, moving into rentals, and using that equity to travel or fund their kids' college education. So it doesn't have to be, the party house, West Campus type of apartments that you think of, but apartments shouldn't be an evil word. It was always those people aren't like us. We don't want renters near our lovely homes. Well, we are them. It turns out in Austin, the greater Austin area, Tom, you may know the exact number now. The last study I saw, we were almost 60% renters in the greater Austin metropolitan area, 55, 58%, somewhere in there. So they don't all have to be in your neighborhoods, but are there places to consider that? So that was my list that I came up with after talking with Tom. And then there's site guidelines I think you should look at. I think you should look at the setbacks along Bee Cave Road like we talked about for kind of the new urbanism look and design that makes it more walkable. And I think you need to think about certain areas, once again, self-promoting, obviously. On the south side, I think is a place where you should think about height, more density, because you're not impacting the immediate residents of Rollingwood in the same way. And if you do think that there is too much traffic being generated from sites, there's another bad word to think about is self-storage. You know, it can now be built to look like office buildings, to look like homes. It's amazing what they do in the right place, and residents need it. You know, your residents are driving distances to go to their self-storage because Americans all have too much stuff. And it's, you know, a self-storage project. I built the one on Loop 360 next to Rudy's, right there by Rudy's Barbecue. Our average traffic is 7 cars a day. You know, a big day would be 15 cars. So, you know, they really work with traffic. Not espousing that it's right. I just say it's something that ought to be on your list to consider and discuss and say yes or no. We really don't want that in our community. The other thing that will hurt you as you try to do economic development and redevelop is look at your parking ratios. Transportation trends are changing in America. Hotels are now being built all around this country that, especially in urban settings, not in more suburban, but in urban settings, that have exactly 0 parking spaces, just pick up and drop off, because if they're tourist oriented, most of the tourists come by Uber and Lyft. And so cities are re-looking at their parking ratios for all types of uses because the market is dictating that people get there different ways than they have in the past. And I'm a big car guy, believe me. I'm into cars, but I think that's something. If you're hard and fast on parking ratios, you're going to see ultimately that you're over parking many of your uses compared to what the real market demand is. And I'll be quiet.
Very good. Does any Ryan?
Yeah, I've got lots of questions. So, I mean, that was awesome. Thank you, Matt.
Let me ask you, Ryan. Do you mind if I also have Sean kind of?
Yeah, that's fine.
I think Sean, being a good dad, has a game he has to go to, and I wanted to kind of get their both input, and then we'll come back and ask our questions if that's okay.
Yeah, Tom, thank you. And Matt and I have known each other for a while, and he certainly is the expert here in the field. The only problem is all the notes, Tom, that I wrote down from our prior visit, Matt stole all my information here apparently. So I don't have a ton to add. He's nailed it all with all the walkability, the streetscape. I think on the northern end can be really modified to promote what you're talking about there, more retail uses, higher sales tax benefits. But the challenge I can see from the banker side is twofold: one physical, one not. You've got existing uses that are already there. The southern end has already got a bunch of existing uses. It's going to take a long time to, like for this office building, for example, to become obsolete and need to be redeveloped. And so same thing with the retail center and those kind of things. But the northern end's got a lot of really good property, but you got existing users. And so I'm not the developer here doing the math to make sure the numbers work, but you're going to have to really incentivize that community to want to buy something that they're going to tear down to be able to go build something, you know, more monstrous on top of it to take advantage of that from a monetary perspective. And so I like to use the Goodyear store, relatively new store, looks in good repair. It's on a really valuable, highly trafficked piece of property. It's flat, maybe some floodplain issues, I don't know, but what are you going to have to build there to be able to motivate them to sell that property to someone else to go build something that's economically feasible? So that's more of a banker type of concern when I look at you know, you can put a lot of cool stuff up and down the corridor, or are you going to do it in such a fashion that makes it attractive for people? Because Matt's not developing property. He's a nice guy, but he's not developing out of the kindness of his heart in most cases. Sometimes he does for good causes. But and so I have a concern how you're going to do that. The other thing I'm just not familiar enough with, I think, Tom, is there some floodplain challenge that you might have to deal with on some of those? That's a banker issue that's the first thing we do in every real estate deal is go pull a flood certificate to make sure that the property is not in the floodplain, or if it is, then it goes kind of down a bad path from a plan and preparation standpoint, and where you can build and those sorts of things. I just don't know what ability the city has to coordinate some kind of water diversion or get, loamers to take things out of the floodplain so that you can maximally take advantage of the sites. And also, one note that I did have here is, can you turn that creek into an amenity of some kind where you get the sit down, high sales per foot, traffic at a restaurant, something like that, or maybe an attractive high-end retail boutique that would really, really appreciate that kind of that river creek setting. Use that as amenity rather than the kind of expense it probably currently is. And then everything else Matt said too. So I'll make that short.
Let me just put one thing out there. Rollingwood does own the land that is located immediately behind the Goodyear plant and all of that shopping area, all the way over to Edgegrove Drive. And I believe it's 5 acres that we own there. And we own that land, the city does. Now, we also went back, good Lord, it's been many years, several years ago, and expecting the floodplain to be a problem, Sean, we actually did the engineering to channelize Dry Creek right there. And we didn't do it. But we got approval from FEMA and the Corps, as I recall. And Amber, jump in if I'm incorrect in this, but I think we got approval to actually channelize the creek right there that would do that. And with the expectation that if anybody ever from the 3,000 block of BKs on the north side, if any development occurred there, redevelopment, that this would be an opportunity to go ahead and implement that plan that we got approved. I think we got that approved, if I'm not mistaken.
Hey, Tom, has there ever been any discussion about creating or implementing a public improvement district to incentivize redevelopment there and have the additional tax income pay for those kind of projects?
We've looked at a number over the years. We've looked at TIFs. We've looked at improvement districts. We've looked at a lot of different ways that we could do that. We haven't had a comprehensive, and part of what we're going to be looking at, we can add to this plan we're doing, Meredith, is that is something that the city should look at to do that.
I mean, because that's the biggest way to incentivize private dollars to come in and make improvements to get benefit that's built in.
And let me remind everybody, we do have a economic development corporation that the city has, and it is a 4B corporation, and it has the ability to provide incentives to the right to profitable to the businesses that deemed that would be beneficial to our city on that. And they have the ability, not only they get a sales tax every year, but they also have the ability to issue bonds going forward. So they can multiply what they get every year. And I think they get 0.25% of sales tax. Amber, is that correct? RCDC?
I think it might be 2/3.
Could be, but they get a percentage of sales tax that in every sales that's taxed in the city of Rollingwood. And that money can be only used for certain things. We call that, it's Rollingwood Community Development Corporation, or RCDC. And if you're not familiar with a 4B, 4Bs are a means for cities to have an economic development commission that also, and it is a corporation. The city council approves its budgets, but it has directors that are independent of the city council and make their own decisions about that. Although the city council obviously appoints those directors and approves their budget on that. But we are limited with RCDC as to what projects and type of projects that we can do. For instance, we can't just put that into general revenue funds. The comptroller, I guess the comptroller would come after Amber, which I always went, when I was mayor, I always went, well, you know, they come get the city administrator. So what's the downside of that? But anyway, we try to keep them around. But I would tell you that that is a source of incentive monies that can be used to help on a project on that. So, but that, and then of course we can do improvement districts and a TIF. And there's a number of other ways that could be done to make that happen. We're even seeing some in-city MUDs that are being used for development. And Matt, I don't know if you've done any of those, but that is, I think if you did it and tried to do it in the city of Austin, you wouldn't get away with, I don't think you'd ever get it done. But I've seen those happen as a means to recoup development issues that go on with that. Anyway, I'm sorry, rambling on. Ryan, I believe you had a couple questions for, many questions maybe for Matt and Sean. So I'll let you take that. And Sean, whenever you need to leave, just please excuse yourself. And we certainly appreciate you being here on that.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank
Yeah, and these are probably kind of open-ended, at least the first one definitely is. One of the things that as I have seen this process move on is that it's finally dawning on me that we should be talking about kind of vision, big picture things. And we are supposed to look at the consequences of our big picture ideas on particular lots, but I do think that it's more of a big picture discussion of what it is that our community wants. As part of that, it's my opinion that we should, to the extent that uses are consistent with what our community wants, at least that part of this should be an opportunity to tell potential property owners or potential developers that, hey, we wouldn't come to us with an idea for this property. You know, we're not necessarily going to be opposed to it just because it's not the existing use or the existing, regulations on it. So my first question, and I'll ask them both, and feel free to answer however you wish, but my first question is, what do you see the market demanding maybe 10 years from now, I guess, but also 10 or 15 years? Where's the pressure? What is the market dying for right now? If you could have these lots on Bee Caves Road be without use restrictions, what would you want them to be right now? And I think that's a way for giving us information on what it is that's realistic for us. That if we did open up more uses, what is it that the market wants? And my second question, you kind of touched upon it a little, which is parking lots. But I think, again, I kind of want to just open up the thinking. And should we? I'd like to tell developers again that, like, if you don't have a high parking, if you don't have a high vehicle use, come to us and tell us, you know, yeah, you have this current restriction, but it doesn't make any sense for the use that I'm planning. And so I guess what do you see down the road as far as cars? What I think I'm hearing you say is even now there's a shift, but my understanding is that 15, 20 years from now, cars may be a thing of the past as far as single person ownership, where you drive your car to one place and you park it for 8 hours, and then you drive it home for another place where you park it for 20, for 16 hours. So those are my questions. What is it that property owners, in your view, would like to do with their lands right now, if it was an open-ended kind of thing and we wanted to invite them? And then second, what should we be communicating to the extent of being open for changes to the way we look at the way cars are used?
Well, thank you. You're thinking like a planner, and you're thinking institutionally and asking the right questions, rather than what does this, 3/4 of an acre tract need to be today. I think that's kind of the charge, is to think institutionally here and by decades. And Sean will probably be able to speak more directly to this, but one of your comments, I love the openness of bring us your ideas if it doesn't conform with the current code. One of the problems of that is the folks that look over Sean's shoulder is the federal regulators. If you come in and give me a variance for a property for parking or for use or for height, the financial markets don't like that, because they're going to look at, he's going to look at the floodplain, and the next thing he's going to look at is what are the regulations that guide this? Is this a conforming use? If it burns down, can I rebuild it in exactly the same configuration under the current code? And if the answer is, they had to get 6 variances to get this done, then it makes it harder for lenders to lend on that. Makes harder for developers to succeed. So, if you see those trends, you almost need to codify them into your code. I'm not against variances. I know, a lot of people don't like to give them because they think they set precedents. They're needed in certain instances. But if you're thinking of more, globally, how are we going to alter things? I would say you'll attract developers by giving them certainty. If you give them certainty with what they can do and what they can build, they will come. If you make it, come and ask me if you don't like it. You could still say that if you have, because there's always an exception to every rule. But if you just say, hey, here's our code, and it may not really be right, but we're very flexible. If they can go down the road somewhere where there's certainty, they will. There's never certainty in Austin, so you have that advantage. And Sean, if he wants to say anything, he can say it on that issue too. But I think that's a universal truth in the development and finance business. I'm looking to see if he clicks off his.
Matt's exactly right, though. If he comes and says, hey, Sean, we want to go buy the Goodyear store, like we were talking about earlier, that's great. What can you do on it? Well, I don't know, but I want to buy it. Having that certainty of what he's able to do there, perform there, flood regulations, if that's fixed up, the design-based code of what he can put on that envelope is going to give him the certainty to where it gives us the confidence in helping him maybe buy that piece of property, or that it will be an advantageous acquisition. And so I'm not really trying to make fun of them here, but that's one of the reasons that everyone has a hard time with the city of Austin is that no one knows any rules of engagement, any certainty of timing. That's the other thing. Timing is the death of a lot of these deals if you can't give them certainty on that. And so when someone doesn't know it's going to take 6 months or 2 years to get their property approved to go build, that's also a significant development cost. And so certainty from that perspective is also very critical. Matt, did that kind of cover some of what you're talking about?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was trying to say. So, and what does the market want? I'm going to give you a different answer than I would have given you 10 years ago. It was, you can't finance anything but single-use buildings. Lenders like to know it's a residential building, it's a retail building, now that's all changed. And although those are the simplest to finance, if you could assemble, frontage, all the frontage along the north side, for example, it could be a fantastic walkable retail with, some office mixed in, maybe the first floor of retail, office on the second, and even residential on the third. I wouldn't propose on that size project that you actually end up with 3 uses, but you might end up with residential above retail uses and have it very walkable with courtyards and utilize the natural amenity of the creek. Those kind of things could happen both on the north and south side. You know, the south side actually is so high that we have views of downtown. So I would think of that as an amenity on the south side, just like you know, it was mentioned, think of the creek as an amenity instead of a nuisance on the north side. You know, whether it's walking trails that go through there and it's enhanced in some way, or it's dining experiences that look over the creek in the back. Think of that, but today mixed use is much more popular. But don't limit yourself to only requiring mixed use, because when you do that, if you're requiring retail where retail really doesn't work, you never get a redevelopment. And I can show you multifamily projects in Austin that have been foreclosed on, where all of the residential was full and the 20% that was retail on the first floor remained vacant, you know, for years. And the project ended up getting foreclosed on because it just wasn't market driven. It was code driven. So be careful about, you know, what you require versus what you allow.
If Matt and Sean, if you had to pick let's just talk about now, what do you see the marketplace right now in the West Bank? And I think both of y'all live in the West Bank today, just from a personal standpoint. What services or goods are not being provided in the West Bank, or could be provided better than they are? Let me put it that way.
Matt, I'll go first, and then I'm going to have to jump off. But not as a employer or employee here, just as a personal resident. I mean, I love Chinatown. I also eat there 4 times a week because there's not an alternative that we have in this corridor that might be attractive. So I think some other non-quick serve dining options would be attractive. And then I think the other one that Matt touched on earlier, it's a little bit taboo in Rollingwood, but alternative, you know, residential options. And they don't even have to be for rent. They could be for rent, but you know, right now you got an option of buying a $2 million lot and tearing it down and living in a tent, or tearing it down and building a $5 million house on it. But there's no, not to say we need to have middle or lower income housing, but you know, what happens when that guy gets divorced and needs to be close to his kids, or someone that works in the area that doesn't want to have to commute and he's a single guy? Or, you know, is that one of the mixed uses that Matt's talking about? Is there an alternative there for one of these sites, or maybe a different site for a different use in the future, thinking 15, 20 years ahead, of a high-end residential community that might be a condominium based, where people don't want to mow their yards anymore for the half acre lot they have in Rollingwood proper over here. So those are a couple of things that just kind of jump to my mind, and I'll send it back to Matt here.
Sure. What's missing? Whataburger. Just as a real estate guy in the Westlake area, I get asked that question so many times. When is Whataburger coming to Bee Cave Road? No, I mean, I think his answer is right. You know, restaurants are popular. I mean, if you look at retail centers today, they are no longer selling hard goods. You know, think of your typical retail center. It's all services. You can get a massage, you can get your teeth done, you can get your nails done. You can, what else can you do? You can have banking services. It's all service oriented. Hard goods are now falling into big boxes in the internet. And so when you think of retail, you have to rethink who those users are. I mean, we all love Ace Hardware and hopes that Breeds never goes away. But, you know, there's certain hard goods that will be around, is my point, but most of them, the small shop owner can't survive. So you're going to think of service-oriented retail and food service when you think of retail in the future. So just remember that as you go forward.
Excellent. Well, I see Sean had to leave. He had to go to a baseball game, which is certainly understandable and proper on that. Ryan, did you get your questions answered, do you think?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on the car question, but also my question about the food services. I'm really worried that we're going to that these surveys are going to come back and everybody wants restaurants. So then we put in here, okay, we want restaurants, and then we have the problem that Matt, you identified, which is that they're not that landowners are having trouble filling retail spots, and so I understand everybody wants restaurants, but I feel like that's different from if the market will support them. But anyway, I was wondering if you had any ideas on that, and then also about the car question.
Let me just make one comment on that from being a long-term West Bank resident. We have probably at one time, now it may have changed at the current time, but most of my history in the West Bank, restaurants did not have a very long life. They came and went regularly in the West Bank. Now there's some exceptions to that, but for the most part, especially for some reason, we went through hamburger places that were not fast food, but set down hamburger places. We went through 3 or 4 of those over about a 6 or 8 year period. And they were coming and going pretty quick on that for a while. Now I think they're stabilized. Maybe, I don't know if we are getting a higher population now, or we're getting people that are just, maybe the restaurants are better funded than they were, 20 years ago. But Matt, I'll let you try to answer that if you don't mind.
Well, historically, we as real estate guys represent a bunch of restaurants. And so I try to get data points from people. I called the Taco Bell people who had been there 40 plus years in that location at Walsh Tarleton and BK Road. I said, why did you close? And answer number one was the rent's going up and it's not affordable. But the real answer when you drilled down was they said every single national restaurant in the West Bank has below market sales average. And our West Bank community has never supported branded restaurants. What we do support, I mean, you remember Tom Macaroni Grill was here, and you go through them, they were doing 30% less sales in their West Bank store than they were doing in the one at the Arboretum. This market is a family-oriented market. Our communities kind of roll up by 10 p.m. In the evening, but we support locally owned restaurants, and Austin is becoming really a hotbed of well-known local, chefs and restaurants. And we don't see that in the West Bank area. I guess Sway is an example of the first one to come to the West Bank. But I think you could see more of that if you had the right type of development.
Matt, on Sway, do you have a sense of how that's doing financially?
I don't. I have a guess, but I don't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Restaurants had a hard time the last 18 months. And I don't think any of them were exception to that rule. Just because they didn't have the occupancy that they could get in to make that happen. So, okay. Any other, Ryan, did that answer your question?
I think so, but I'm going to try one more if you have any more thoughts on the cars question.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
What were you asking about the cars and parking lots?
Yeah, I mean, and it may be just a thought that is not fully developed and not fully developed enough for an answer, but I mean, are you seeing people yet? I know the hotels are an example. I think a hotel is probably pretty unlikely for us because we couldn't spend the money. That the taxes are restricted in hotels under state law, so I'm not sure we could spend the money if we had one. But are there is it yet hitting the marketplace, the development marketplace for where someone else might want to propose some other kind of project that either has no or limited cars. Because one of my issues with driving down Bee Caves is when you look left and look right, you see a lot of parking lots with buildings at the back of them.
Mhm.
And I know that's because they were developed in an era where everybody drove everywhere.
Mhm.
And again, just talking about the vision thing, trying to get to what it is that this community might want. I was just wondering if there's any pressure yet, besides hotels, to limit parking requirements. And again, you mentioned about variances. My goal would be that we would kind of develop an overall vision for our community where somebody wouldn't have to come with ask for a variance, that we would be more upfront about the types of uses that we'd be okay with in the future.
I'm not a transportation expert. You need to get Terry Mitchell on here, who's goes to all the conferences on transportation, because he's on the Cap Metro board, which I know we don't get the Cap Metro tax. They don't stop in Rollingwood, but he studies all those kind of trends. He would be a good person for you to talk to, and I'd be happy to get you his cell phone number. I was on a Zoom call with him at 2. The cars aren't going away in Texas. We might figure out, my children may be in a car share situation like you were talking about, where you pick one up and use it when you need it. Even McMorris Ford, if you go up there right now, will sell you a third of an F-150 or a quarter of a Taurus, and you're literally splitting time with other buyers on that car. So Austin is a test market for that concept. But as developers and as bankers, we're gonna have to build to what the market has been. It's hard to get out in front of the market, so I think you're gonna have to live with a significant number of cars. But there's certain uses, and I'm not proposing this, but self-storage. That building on BK Road on 360 I built, the city of Austin code required 60 spaces. We were able to take other facilities of the same size that we had built in Lakeway and Bastrop and Round Rock and show 7 spaces in front of the building, and never more than 2 are occupied. But code said 60. So there are specific uses that'll pop up, and trends will pop up, but I'm not an expert here.
Ryan, that take care of you?
I mean, Ryan, I've always said in the development business, cars drive the development, meaning that what the city requires me, the number of parking spaces the city requires me to have per use, determines how much space is left for me to build a building. Mm-hmm. So you literally reverse engineer a site. You go in and you go, okay, I want to be retail, and if I have to have 5 spaces per 1,000 square feet for retail, you start figuring out at 300 square feet per parking space on average, you back into how much building you can put there. So in our current models, cars drive the development scheme. And I think a better model that cities are going to are more form-based. This is what we want our city to look like in the future. We want stone and brick on this percentage of the building. We want this much glass on the building. We want them to be pulled up to the street and have a sidewalk that's 10 feet or 12 feet wide with a tree and what you hide inside of it is not so much of a concern inside. Now you're trying to drive retail sales. I understand that. But I think the trend across America for development is to look at the form and not as much the use.
Right.
That's really helpful. I mean, I think there are probably uses that people are not going to be happy with in our community, and so we have to be mindful of uses. My hope is that we will open up opportunities to change uses that where a restriction on a use may not make sense long term. And frankly, I love the idea of talking about what we'd like to see rather than how many parking spaces you have. I would want Rollingwood to be on the forefront of not having development be determined by the number of parking spots you have to have.
Yes, sir.
I feel that this discussion is very interesting to me. However, the elephant in the room that I bring up repeatedly anytime I'm in a meeting is that we have 100-foot green belt, the full length of the north side of Bee Caves Road. Every developer I have talked to about my property come back to me and they say, well, you can't do anything here. You're sitting with the majority of your property sitting in a 100-foot green belt. And they happen to be true. When I get done with setbacks and green belt, I end up out of 4.63 acres with 1.7 acres developable.
Yeah.
That, when you look at my property, and it's one of the prime properties you look at for development, it's why I remain relatively quiet, because the city, by virtue of that green belt, it was totally unnecessary, except for the fact they didn't want to be attacked by Endeavor by putting the 100-foot green belt on the back of the now Rolling Woods Center. And they were afraid they were going to get attacked by them telling you can't do it as spot. So they did the whole north side. The 100-foot green belt behind the property you say the city owns. All your city 5 acres sits in that 100-foot green belt.
And I think
something needs to be done. If you want developers to even look at this area for any kind of development, you got to get rid of the green belt, because it was only put there to protect the people down there behind the Del Alamo tract.
Right. The setback, it's a setback rather than green belt, but same effect. I understand that. But
well, no, when you name a green belt, that's covered by state law.
Yeah.
And the state law basically says you can't do anything with it. And to say that, well, gee, you can, if your building burned down, we'll let you build it again. I'm not sure that the city of Rollingwood has a right to say I can build it again. I think the state law overwhelms the city's desires. It was a bad idea when it was put in. It was put in without any additional notice. It was put in on the meeting I sat at. When I was sitting there, the mayor sat there and said, well, we ought to just extend the green belt all the way up to Bee Caves Road to Rollingwood Drive. And everybody said, yeah, that's a good idea. I passed. And that's how it got there. And it sat there for now, I guess, close to 20 years.
Well,
it is a great impediment. Anything development you want to talk on the north side of Bee Caves Road, you've got to talk about the green belt, and you've got to talk about setbacks, because the lots down there, Edge Grove, those lots are very shallow when you consider all they have is the frontage and the depth of their building, and they're on top of the creek.
And I agree that needs to be looked at. Now, I would tell you, as I remember correctly, it's been a long time, but I thought that was a building setback, not a green belt, but I'll check and make sure of that.
Please do, because if I'm wrong, a couple of the developers I talked to, because I just wanted to see what they would have on mind, whether anything would work. They went to the city and, well, you got a 100-foot green belt. Your buildings are sitting in the green belt. All we have left to deal with is the parking lot. And the parking lot's got setbacks on it, front and sides.
And I think, I really think that our setbacks need to be looked at both on the front and the rear, almost on specifically, and Ryan, I think this is where the lot by lot basis could be useful, is to come in on that. Now, Wally's situation is on that particular piece of property, there is, help me, Wally, 40 feet cliff at the back of your property.
Yeah, we got a 40-foot tall, pardon me, 40-foot tall stacked rock wall at the back of the property.
Yeah.
And then the shelves, I didn't build the building. The shelves were cut in down to the bedrock, which is why the building stepped, because the bedrock area was a sloping bedrock. And so the buildings that you see there on Bee Caves, the Palisades, they're all sitting on rock.
And I think prior to the 100-foot setback, building setback is what I think it is. But prior to that, the building setback was 30 feet.
The Palisades, the rear of the Palisades buildings sit back from the upper properties 30 feet.
Yeah. I
But
think
keep in
that-
mind, the upper properties behind them are sitting on a slope up. And in fact, I took some pictures this winter. I was going to show you, Tom. The fellow that sits behind my building D, which is the furthest one to the east, his property sits probably his floor elevation is just a little higher than the roof elevation of my three-story building. And that's his first floor.
Yeah, and I think that's, and the front setbacks are an additional thing that I believe we need to look at right now. And it looks like to me that if we're trying to look at this thing from the next decades rather than the next years, all the new development I see going around has the building up front and parking behind it. Even restaurants, I'm seeing that for the most part. Now there's some older buildings that have been retrofitted, but even the new ones that I see are going in. Matt, can you give me any guidance on that? But that's what it looks like to me that I see that's going in on that.
You know, the only thing I would say is different than that is when there is an amenity, when you have a dry creek bed that you can orient towards, you know, they do like to utilize those as, you know, outdoor space, especially here in the Austin area. We love our outdoors. And so I think you have to think about that too when that situation arises. But yes, in general, your community is going to be much more appealing if you make it walkable and you pull the buildings up towards the street. And you know, Mr. Grainer is absolutely right. I mean, you know, you look at the narrowness of the north side, and I mean, you don't have much depth of your commercial on either side of the road, but you look at the narrowness of the buildable area, and there's not any reason to ever redevelop because under the current code, you know, you can't get enough area onto it to make it economically feasible to tear something down.
Interesting. Okay. Let me ask, and Wally, I'm not discounting that because I think you're all spot on that what has to be looked at on that for the setbacks, both front and back. But I wanted to ask Matt one other question while we've got him. You talked about restaurants, even the upper end restaurants having a drive-through or pickup area.
Mm-hmm.
Stacking has always been the big issue. And of course, you know, Whataburger, not, you know, I know everybody wants Whataburger in the West Bank, or some people do. Most people do, I guess. But stacking is the biggest problem Whataburger has, because they're not quite as fast food as some of the others, and it takes a little bit longer, and you're stacking cars. So most of these restaurants we're talking about, we're going to have to allow for stacking on that to do a pickup area. I'd rather call it be a pickup area rather than a drive-through type of thing.
Good spin.
So if we're talking about a little upper end restaurant, generally, how many are they stacking? 4 or 5 cars?
I mean, today they don't really have them. But what we are seeing is we represent these you know, higher end restaurants wanting new locations. You know, unless they're in the urban core, they are looking for locations where that can occur. And right now, I don't think any municipality has thought about it. You might think of it more like a CVS drive-through or a Walgreens drive-through. I mean, those high-end restaurants aren't going to be high volume, but you know, think about the Favor and the, you know, Uber Eats and all those kind of places are now picking up from those restaurants. And you know, especially during the pandemic, if you walked into a restaurant, a lot of times there was 4 or 5 drivers standing there, and there were cars sitting outside with their flashers going. You know, for those drivers parked behind regular parking spaces. So it's just a trend we're seeing, and I think it's more allowing for it, and the market isn't developed enough to know whether that's 7 cars or 3 cars, Tom.
And one other question I'll have, and then unless somebody else has one, I don't want to monopolize this, but Matt, do we have any chance to get any of the higher end restaurants from downtown Austin to move to BK's?
Not without redevelopment. I mean, I can't think of any buildings that really would have tracked them in their current configurations. But with redevelopment, yes.
If we, and that would be, but they would still they'd still be marketed as their customer base would still also come from downtown Austin.
Yeah, and I mean, Central Austin really, just like we've seen South Lamar become part of Central Austin, where it used to be South Austin. If you put development that's desirable, people will come and leave their tax dollars with you, and then they'll go back home to their house in the city of Austin, and you don't have to provide any city services to them other than that restaurant or retail space. It's the most desirable kind of economic development you can have. I mean, it's really tourist, right? They come, you don't have to educate their children, you don't have to give them fire protection, except for the 2 days that they're there, but they leave $1,000 a day or $500 a day in your community. So building things that are attractive for outsiders to come in and then go back to their homes outside of the city of Rollingwood is a great economic factor. By the way, my dad ran the Austin Chamber of Commerce for 28 years. He's the guy that started recruiting high tech to Austin and started a lot of the festivals in the 1960s and stuff. So I grew up around the dinner table listening to economic development talk. So I credit a lot of this to Vic Mathias, not Matt Mathias. I'm just a little puppet over here.
Your dad did a great job.
Thank you.
Great job. Do we have anybody have any other questions of Matt? Hey, Matt, thank you so much for taking your time. Ryan?
Yeah, I was wanting to give anybody else the opportunity because I'm talking too much, but if no one's going to take it, I do have another question. So I'll just sit back and see if anybody else does first.
Any other questions?
I have one, Matt. Back on the restaurants and kind of the return profile for redevelopment. I mean, are there restaurants that can generate the revenue that could, yield an attractive redevelopment return? I mean, obviously there are a lot of unknowns, right? The biggest one being the zoning question. But I don't know if you've seen anyone try to pencil that out or kind of really run through that.
The freestanding restaurants used to be very large. Now we're seeing large, more 3,000 to 6,000 square foot restaurants. And when it comes to higher end, because they foresee sending so many of those meals out the door where you're having your dining experience at your own outdoor space or in your dining room. So their dining rooms are shrinking. So yes, with the wealth that surrounds you in the West Bank area as a whole, and I think the right brand pulls from Pemberton and Tarrytown also. I mean, I go to the Salt Trader every now and then and I thought, well, this will be a local fish restaurant. We don't have a fish restaurant. This will be the local Westlake fish restaurant. I don't know anyone in that restaurant. I mean, they're coming from Circle C and Travis Country and all over to get there. So I think if you put a concept in that is attractive, the numbers will pencil because you're so close to dense population. Even though you're large lot, there's a lot of density that surrounds Rollingwood that it'll draw from.
Thanks. It's helpful.
Great. I have one other question of Matt, Ryan, then I'll turn him over. Just comment. If you were doing a project in the city of Austin and it was, let's assume for a second there wasn't a zoning issue, but all the paperwork and all the process you have to go through, having zoning, but you do have to get a plat and everything. How much time would you allocate to that generally in Austin?
Tom,
and it's uncertain, and I know that.
No, Tom, even if you have a platted lot, if you don't have to plat it, so you got zoning and platting, you got a lot that you and I would call ready to go. Once you submit your site development plan to the city of Austin, so that may take you 3 or 4 months to design, but once you make that submission, it is taking a full year to get your site development permit. Once you get through several rounds of comments, you submit your building permit, because that's a quicker process. You can get that done in 60 days, maybe 90 days at most. So you run it concurrent once you feel certain you're going to get to build what you want to build. But I tell all of our clients to plan on at least a year. And now during the pandemic, there's no telling, because there's no city staff in any of the buildings, that you know, the development staff. But under normal circumstances in 2019, a full year to get a permit on a platted lot, zoned lot. And that's a huge detriment, because sellers won't wait for you.
Yeah.
And that's the risk that Sean was talking about, you know, needing certainty.
Right.
You know, when I went into Bastrop to do a 100,000 foot project in Bastrop, they said you will be in and out in 4 to 5 weeks. Now, they had a floodplain study hit after I applied, and I had a 4-month delay while they put a moratorium on all permits, all in the city. But the process should have been 4 or 5 weeks. That kind of certainty will bring economic growth to you. There's no doubt, and it doesn't have to be that fast, but certainty is my message to you today.
And if you had to go through, let's just say that's a year minimal right now, if after zoning, but if you had to go through zoning, how much time would you allocate to a fellow on a project like that? Just in Boston.
Same thing. I tell people 7 months. And the reason is it's really a 3-month process, but your district council member can have a 30-day delay for no reason. The neighborhood gets a 30-day delay for no reason. And then the applicant gets a 30-day delay for no reason, which, unless there's a reason, you know, you're going to lose the vote is the reason. You don't ever call for that. So it takes a 3-month zoning process to really normally usually a minimum of 5 to 7 months.
Okay. Right.
So if you start with land that needs zoning, you're talking about a minimum of 1.5 years to get approvals in Austin.
Brian, I think you had another question.
I do, but I was just again, I want to wait for anybody else. I feel like I'm talking too much.
Ryan, both of us have been.
All right, well, I'll ask if nobody else has their hand up. You mentioned, at least you said something that hit a question for me. And by the way, my father also was in economic development, so I think we probably had similar dinner table conversations growing up. One of the things that I've talked to some people about, that some people are excited about the possibility of, is some kind of town center type approach to our development. People have, like David Smith has talked about, you know, if you go to Colorado, there's always kind of a vibrant town center that's very walkable. A lot of people can walk to restaurants or shops, and I don't know if that's even remotely a possibility for us, but I love the idea of having a series of, you know, on the north side, a series of 2-story buildings that people can walk to, that are vibrant, that are nice, both aesthetically and the services that they provide. And one of the things I've talked about is eliminating side setbacks so that we can, you know, encourage landowners to work together rather than everybody being their own little island with setbacks on every side, on the fronts and the backs and the sides. If a town came to you and said, how can we encourage that? How can we encourage landowners to work together to come up with more of a big picture? What would you need to hear from the city? As someone on your side, what do you need to hear from us? What is it that we need to say, communicate, do that would attract some kind of larger vision of a walkable, aesthetically pleasing urban space?
You know, your problem is you're starting out with income producing properties on both sides of the road. You know, Wally's not going to sell the Palisades for land value, right? He's got income producing buildings there that the income stream is worth more than the land is worth. So you've got to allow enough redevelopment to occur to allow someone to buy it and buy it at market price for what's there and tear it down and rebuild. And you're not likely to ever get there with 2-story buildings. I mean, you can't generate enough new income from it to support the cost of buying and tearing down. You could do something lovely along the north side if you had all those property owners together, but I'm not sure it's economically feasible at a couple of stories. On the south side, you've got the center, I guess 1, 2, and 3. You've got the hospital, and then you've got the office building just to the east of the hospital. Those all have more depth. And if you think about town centers, they tend to have a courtyard and be interior focused. But once again, you're going to have to tear down buildings to do it. So it's a walkable development is possible on the north side, but if you're trying to keep the heights and density down, it's not likely. If you go to the south side where you have more depth, and you're away from the residential, I know your residents then have to cross Bee Cave Road, which isn't as desirable. If you get the height and density on the south side, there's a Class C office building next to the hospital. The hospital may or may not be there 15 years from now. And the 2 office buildings on the west of us would be called Class B at best. I can see redeveloping those if you said, okay, you can go 5 stories, or you can do more density there and do structured parking. It could happen on that side of the road because of the depth. But you're going to have to incentivize them enough financially to get rid of the existing uses.
Incredibly helpful. Thank you.
Great. Any other questions of Matt? I don't see him. Matt,
Tom, how much did I agree to? What was my fee for this?
Listen, I'll double it. Right now. You're very helpful, I think.
Oh.
The good part is whatever we put here, you'll probably be using.
You bet. Absolutely.
Matt,
Thank you. And hey guys, thank you all for serving and on free. I did it for a couple hours on one day. You guys are putting some time into it. So I appreciate you very much. And Tom, I sent you an email with the list that I mentioned a while ago and some thoughts.
Right.
If you want to circulate my name and my signature blocks at the bottom with my cell phone and email, I'd be happy to make myself available to anyone but Ryan. No, kidding, Ryan.
Well,
You're not the only one.
Matt, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Goodbye.
Extraordinarily helpful.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Well, I'll tell you what I would kind of like to do on BK's Road. I really am. I can look at. I've looked at every lot, and I know what I want personally, which I'm in the process of filling out my survey questions to put that in there to make sure that gets in the survey. I would prefer us not to go through each lot and say what we would prefer right now until we get the survey, because I think that's certainly going to impact what I'm looking at. And I think it will probably impact everybody else. I think there's some things that we can start to, and that'll be back with us by our next meeting, I think. So we'll have a pretty good indication of that. But on this meeting, the remaining time that we have on this, and I hope everybody, doesn't mind me inviting these guys. I thought getting some very experienced people and looking at how these projects are going to be looked at might be useful to us as we go forward on that. And I've invited several other people that are involved in development on bee caves and that actually own property in Rollingwood to come to if they want to on that. And we've got some, and I'm not minimizing Wally and Meredith's, both of y'all are experts. Y'all been doing it a long time. Meredith, not you. I won't give you the long time on that. You've done it a long time, but not as long as Wally has. So let me put it that way. Now, I think some of the things that Wally brought up are things that we do need to look at. Setbacks, I think, are going to be critical to whatever we look at. And it has been, at the time that these came up, traditionally, for the most part of Rollingwood's history, we've had three basic requirements of commercial properties that have kind of dictated what we had. We have a situation where we had impervious cover on commercial properties of 50%. And you could go beyond that with certain requirements, but generally it was 50%. And so that limited a lot of the building area that we've had. We had a 20-foot front setback and I believe 20-foot side setbacks and a 30-foot rear setback up until around 2002, I believe, is when that came in. So, and then we implemented a 100-foot setback, and I think that's going to be a setback, Wally, rather than a green belt. But that it has the same effect that you can't build on that to that area. So it had the same effect on that. And this is where I think, where we can have, rather than looking at the uses till we get the survey back, we can look at maybe some of the physical attributes of these lots and try to figure out what we would look at from a standpoint of setbacks, building area, the parking code. I'll be honest, that's Matt is exactly right. And that is there are recommendations that go in with the uniform building code that also comes into the parking code, and that changes every couple, 3-4 years. So I would yes.
Sorry to jump in. I just have one question. Isn't it pretty hard to really think about setbacks and parking without the use being defined? I mean, to me, right, those are all pretty tightly linked. And so if we're already going to exclude a bunch of uses that might resonate with a certain kind of setback or other profile on parking, I don't know, it feels like we're maybe spinning our wheels on things that will be moot ultimately with a more constrained, set of uses.
Yeah, and I think that's a great part. And I was going to say, parking is something that I think that is a little bit different thing for us to look at. And I think we look at a higher elevation issue rather than parking ratios. There are the setbacks, I think, are something that are going to be generally there, that, like Ryan was talking about, the side setbacks. If we want a walkable deal, you almost have to do away with the side setbacks or minimize them. And I think you do away with them myself, because I think I'd rather see cars considering one project as opposed to multiple ones. But Jeff, you're exactly right. And the setbacks, though, are going to be, if we're looking at encouraging, and one thing, and this is my personal feeling, this doesn't have anything to do with everybody else's beliefs, I would prefer to see the buildings be pushed further towards the roadway and parking and green areas in the back, as opposed to the way they are right now, frankly, and especially on the north side of BK's Road, because that way we would have a minimal. Now there are parking. When you have a parking lot, you have lighting. You're required to have lighting. And so that is a issue with our neighbors on Timberline, but you also can get around that. I mean, not around it, but you can mitigate it so that you don't have a problem. And Jeff, you've got is lighting bother you? Do you have a problem with
I'm
lighting?
just a neighbor on Timberline, that's all.
So
Yes.
on that. But that's what that's where we have. And yes, we can discuss some of the setback issues that we have, I think, before you have a use, because I don't think you're going to, I don't think you're going to be able to put a setback on a specific use. I think it's going to be, I think you're going to have a a fairly good idea about what you're going to go in before a use comes in on that. So now the other thing that I would think that we could spend our time on is, okay, so we know that if Matt's right, there are a possibility for us to get some higher end restaurants on BK's Road in Rollingwood. And they keep asking incentives. Well, you know, the biggest incentive developers have, is I'm listening to these two guys, is certainty. And if you're going into the city of Austin and you have an 18-month window, the market changes in 18 months. So, you know, from a process time, we're probably running 90 days now, I would guess. Maybe 120 days. Amber or Ashley, what does it take to get a project through City of Rollingwood?
Oh, I would say less than 90 days. At most 60, 45 to 60 days.
Okay. So that's an incentive to our development community there. Now, I don't want to rush things through and not so we get something haphazard, but you know, that's where we come in, having a vision, a big vision of what our citizens want. And so you don't get the issue about so much about zoning on that comes in, or usage on that. So, and I'm perfect, Jeff, and I'll just tell you, I'm perfectly happy to say, okay, let's just wait. We're going to have a survey back in 2 weeks. Let's just, by God, wait till we get that back, and then we can kind of apply it to our lots in a high level vision about what we can do.
Right.
Now, there is a conflict, and Ryan, you spoke about it earlier, of what I would consider our long-term Rollingwood vision and our direction that we were asked to look at each lot individually and make a recommendation. And that's a conflict, I believe, that's there, but we can do that. And I think, but you look at it from the standpoint of each lot, what would we have now? And then we look at the overall vision of Rollingwood on that as a little bit separate animal.
I do think when the city council directed the lot by lot, that I don't know that they were saying you shouldn't think globally, but more of keep in mind the impact of any development on any particular lot and how that would affect the adjacent property owners. And I think as long as we do that, we're going to be fine.
Right. Well, that's a good point on that. And you know, I would ask, if you have not had an opportunity to look at BK's Road, and unfortunately, there's a part of it that I would encourage you not to walk down, since we'll probably lose you if you do. But we do have a sidewalk on half of it anyway. And if you take a look at this as you drive through, and feel free to drive into BK Woods Drive and go up into see the hospital and the hospital district, because you can't see that very well from BK's Road as to what happens, what we have there. So there are two things that I pointed out earlier. Some may not be on here. We have, there was on your zoning map, I believe that 5100 Rollingwood Drive, which is a residential house, is zoned commercial. It was at one time. And we're going to check on that and make sure and see if it's been revised or not. The other thing that I will tell people to kind of look for, if you go on BK's Road, there's a 14,000 square foot little office building that's adjacent to the hospital. And it's very easy to miss, but that is a separate project from the hospital on that. And it is in the city of Rollingwood on that. So I would prefer that we kind of wait until we wait till we get the survey back. And as I understood, we had about 20 odd some that have already filled them out. And I'm trying to get mine in, and Sandra's doing some stuff. She hadn't sent hers in yet. But I would encourage everybody to please remind people to send the survey back. These are online so far. Ashley, we just received the postcards today, and they're getting ready to go out in the mail. And we plan to also hand deliver one of these postcards to each house in Rollingwood. So it should be no excuse for anybody not filling one out. So the last thing I will talk about in regard to our work session on Bee Cave Road is we had discussed, in my notes, I had marked down that we were going to do a survey for the business owners and tenants of Bee Caves Road. And I don't think we've done that yet, but I will try to draft up a very simple, very short little survey for the tenants and the building owners on Bee Caves Road and disseminate that to everybody on our task force and let them kind of give me their comments back. And I'd like to get that one out really quick to see that, but I'll try to draft that out here in the next, probably I'll have it by the end of the week, Friday anyway, to everybody. So does anybody have any other questions or comments that they'd like to make? And I think we had a couple of our citizens on, but I don't see them on now. If not, and if we are okay, if everybody's okay with that, I'm just going to close our work session and wait until we have our next meeting, and hopefully we'll have enough data that we can start finishing up Bee Caves Road. So, anything else? Great. Okay. Any other business we have? I think I went over the survey and I think it turned out great and it looks good. I like the way that that was put together. So I think that's going to be, we're going to get some good data there. Any public comments of anybody that we have, or anybody else want to bring up anything? Not hearing any. Could I have a motion to adjourn?
Move to adjourn.
Move to adjourn. And do I have a second?
Second.
Second. And again, I hope Matt and Sean were beneficial to everybody. They're very
Yes.
experienced, and I think it would be, I thought it would be useful for us to hear what the horse's mouth, if you would. Wally's a developer of sort. He's an entrepreneur. Airline guy, building guy, jack of all trades. Anyway, we have a motion and a second. And so we are now adjourned. Thank you all very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank
And
you.
Ashley and Amber, thank y'all.
You too.